Hello, everyone. I'm Heikkila, a professor at the USC Price School of Public Policy. And this is one in a series of presentations that I'm giving on my new book, China from a US Policy Perspective. Today, we're going to talk about China from US Foreign Relations Perspective. The US, together with its allies, was instrumental in setting up the world order that has, in some fashion or another, prevailed over the last 75 years. And a key part of that order is comprised of the institutions that help to define and manage cooperation within this world order, affecting issues such as trade, economic development, lending, issues of peace between nations, etc. Now, the world has changed in many ways in that last 3/4 of a century, and these institutions have struggled to adapt to these changes. One change that's of particular interest for our purposes here is the recent rise of China. Now, as China has grown in prominence, it has thus far shown a willingness to a reasonable extent of working with and through these institutions, and has indeed been an active participant within the United Nations, within WTO, World Bank, etc. Having said that, China is clearly does not feel need to be confined or constrained by these institutions. And of course, to be fair, that's true as well for the United States from time to time. But in the case of China, this is perhaps most evident with the Belt and Road Initiative, which is a major undertaking announced in 2013 that is operating rather than through the World Bank and other institutions that are US-centric. It has created its own institutions where China itself is the dominant player, and has used these institutions to lead this Belt and Road Initiative, which has a focus largely on connectivity between China and markets primarily elsewhere in this Asian landmass, but not confined strictly to that. And much of this has been in the form of infrastructure investments that facilitate the movement of goods and people between China and its trading partners. Now, this approach, in many ways, is an echo, and certainly consistent with the general approach that China has taken in terms of its own economic development over recent decades. As shown in this graph, China's expenditures on infrastructure over recent decades have taken up 8.6% of GDP, which far exceeds the share of GDP that other countries have devoted to infrastructure spending. And in particular, if we look at the United States, Canada, Western Europe, we've spent about 2.5% of GDP on infrastructure. So in many ways, that can be explained by the fact that China and the US are at very different stages of economic development. The United States, as a developed country, has already put in place much of the infrastructure that it builds upon. Whereas in China, in the case of China and other developing countries, it's more likely the case that the lack of infrastructure at those early stages of economic growth and development, that lack of infrastructure is a kind of binding constraint, and therefore investment in expanding infrastructure capacity makes good economic sense. Nonetheless, there would be those who argue, and I think with some justification, that the United States may be underinvesting in infrastructure investment. Either way, that has been a significant component of this Belt and Road investment initiative, where these investments are both in terms land-based bridges and corridors to facilitate trade, and investments in seaports and other facilities, other capacity to facilitate the movement of goods through maritime channels. There's, in addition to the economic aspect of the Belt and Road Initiative, which in turn is emblematic of what China is doing more broadly in the world. So BRI, as the Belt and Road Initiative is referred to, is important here, but it's not the only thing that China is doing in the world that has significance. But because it's closer to home, it's more concentrated. Home in the case of China, it's more concentrated, and it gives us a better sense of China's strategic development approach. Now, in addition to the economics dimension of that is a geopolitical dimension. And interestingly, that geopolitical dimension was articulated over 100 years ago by an English geographer, Mackinder, who said that who rules East Europe commands the heartland. Who rules the heartland commands the world island, referring to the Asian landmass. And who rules the world island commands the world. So in some ways, we can think of China's Belt and Road Initiative as following up on Mackinder's advice, but from the perspective of moving east to west, rather than what Mackinder surely had in mind, which was a movement from west to east. Part of that geopolitical significance, of course, rests on the fact that China's western boundaries, particularly the Xinjiang province, neighbors many countries in Central Asia that have historical, cultural links to the indigenous people in Xinjiang. And from China's perspective, it's clear, therefore, that the Belt and Road Initiative may be another means for China to essentially underline, exert, and reinforce its presence in the region, and thereby not only promoting economic growth and trade and for China and its neighbors, providing a land link to Europe, etc., but also establishing for itself a more secure presence in this rather restive part of the world. So what are the implications then for the United States of China's growing influence and expansion throughout the Asian continent? Here we are, the United States in North America. What are the implications for us? Well, those implications really fall into a number of areas: economic, geopolitical, including military. I won't go into the defense aspects much here because one of my other presentations focuses in much more detail on that, on the defense and military aspects. But let's not forget that that's an important part of this. Also, issues of human rights, and really the nature of alliances that the United States has with many of the countries in this region as they fall more and more into China's orbit, as it were, then that begs the question of what the role is with the United States. What is the nature, the evolving nature of our alliances in the region? And more broadly, what does this say for what kind of world order might be emerging? Now, when we look at China's influence in the region economically, it's clear from this graphic that China's influence over the last 2 decades has really grown by leaps and bounds. Just 2 decades ago, the United States was still the dominant trading partner with East Asia and the Pacific, excluding China, and much more so than China's, or certainly more so than China's trade with that same region, East Asia and the Pacific, excluding China. But when we move forward to now, we see that China far outpaces the US, both in terms of exports to and imports from the rest of East Asia and the Pacific. And the US trade has actually fallen in real terms over that same interval. So that's important on its own terms economically, but it also means that China has growing economic leverage that may be used to pursue some of its other aims in the region. And most importantly, from China's perspective, it's clear that a top priority is to ensure its territorial integrity, as we saw, for example, just earlier in the case of Xinjiang, but that it also applies in Hong Kong and Taiwan, for example. Now, in the case of Hong Kong, China has made it abundantly clear, especially just recently with the passing of its national security law, that makes it clear that China prioritizes security above any other considerations that are part and parcel of the one country, two systems formula that has been in place since the repatriation of Hong Kong to China. Now, the US clearly has no claim in terms of sovereignty, territoriality, et cetera, with respect to Hong Kong, but the United States has had a strong presence, business presence, and broader presence in Hong Kong. And there's clearly an affinity between the US and Hong Kong in terms of shared values of a kind of liberal democracy, although the tradition of democracy within Hong Kong has been tentative or tenuous at best, including during the British colonial period. In the case of Taiwan, again, it's fairly clear that China's sovereignty claims over Taiwan have a strong basis in history and in international law. And that diplomatically, Taiwan, as shown in this graphic, has become increasingly isolated diplomatically as virtually all countries around the world, including the United States, recognize China, and China is in the United Nations, represented in the United Nations, whereas Taiwan government is not. So nonetheless, this poses some foreign relations and foreign policy challenges for the United States, which on the one hand wants to be a good friend and loyal ally to Taiwan, with which it's had close relations since the formation of the People's Republic of China, yet at the same time wanting to be realistic about China's claims, both in a kind of legal context and in terms of de facto recognition of China's growing economic power and military power and influence broadly within the region. So while over time, China's growing power gives it more potential capacity to enforce its claims, sovereignty claims over Taiwan, during that same passing of time that has seen China's strength build up, it has also seen the sort of strengthening of Taiwan's separate identity, the people in Taiwan feeling quite strongly, in large measure, that they are not, do not view themselves as being part of mainland China, and certainly not part of that same political representation. But China's growing influence, represented by Belt and Road Initiative, by its diplomatic moves in terms of Hong Kong, Taiwan, Xinjiang, elsewhere, not just diplomatic moves, but really moves across the spectrum. While that has important economic, geopolitical, diplomatic, and even military implications, there's really more to it as well. And that really is the iconic or representational values, the symbolic values of what does a Hong Kong that is struggling against China's increasing control? What about Taiwan that represents a kind of little stand against kind of holding on to democratic values and a separate set of kind of Western-oriented values that are inculcated within a Chinese cultural tradition? What does this represent? And more broadly, what does China represent to the world, and what does the United States represent to the world? And if we look at surveys, including this recent survey done by the Pew Research Center, we see that notwithstanding the many travails that the United States has been through in the last few years, it's still the case that the US is broadly perceived on more favorable terms than China is by many countries around the world. And that, in turn, calls into question, brings us full circle to the question of what kind of world order, if anything, shall evolve from the Bretton Woods US-centric world order that has been in place over the last 3/4 of a century. As noted at the outset, the world is changing in fundamental ways, and China's rise is a very significant part of that. And there are many other changes that deserve recognition as well. The question then for the US and other countries is, how do we respond to that? How do we adapt accordingly? And in particular, what kind of institutions or institutional changes are needed, for example, within WTO or within United Nations organizations designed to address issues of climate change, et cetera. So there questions about what kind of institutions do we want to see, and what kinds of practices of behaviors and of political norms and protocols do we wish to inculcate in terms of a world order 2.0. And perhaps most fundamentally of all, it comes down to a question of what are the values that drive these practices, which in turn might inform the kinds of institutions that we want to put in place. And ultimately, then it does come down to what are the values that we ourselves hold in the United States. China may have a different set of values. That's their prerogative in a world order where there are sovereign countries that each which has its own political system, its own order. Even if we do have legitimate concerns about what goes on in China, for example, in Xinjiang in terms of human rights, etc., really, for the beginning point for the United States, if it looks to bridge these divides that we find globally, is to start here at home, to think, because if at home within the United States, we're not able to bridge the values that divide us, if we're not able to generate social justice through our institutions, through our investments, through our expressed and displayed priorities, then we're not likely in a position to succeed at doing that on a global scale as well. So that's a quick look at how the rise of China has an impact on US perspectives on foreign relations. Thank you for joining me, and see you next time.